Okay. Nice to meet you all. Today I'm going to be talking about some irrational causes of war. Last time we talked about rational causes of war, if you recall. I'll do a little bit of a review of that. And the reason it's entitled Some Irrational Causes of War is because there are many, unfortunately, and we're only going to go over a few in the time we have, and I'll leave as much time for questions as possible. So last time we talked about what rationality was not. We said that rationality was not a claim that people were just or good. We talked about Hitler's methodical madness. We also talked about how rationality does not imply complete information, and that things in this scenario are a gamble and about probability. We talked about also how what are the working criteria for rationality? So how do we know when something's rational? Well, actors who are rational have goals. They can rank these goals from most to least valuable. They pursue these goals as best they know how, given incomplete information. And then finally, they update their incomplete beliefs accurately in response to new information. And that last one will become especially important today when we talk about things like bias. So then we had this very handy table that Dr. Jordan provided that sort of sets the rational leader apart from the irrational leader. So today I'll be discussing mostly why leaders are irrational in a sense. So we said that actors have goals, whereas irrational leaders aren't goal-oriented. Rational leaders can rank these goals. Irrational leaders have vague and confused priorities. Irrational leaders are sloppy, emotional in the pursuit of their goals. I thought that kind of described me pretty well, so I was a little bit offended by that. Rational leaders update their incomplete beliefs accurately in response to new information, and irrational leaders ignore or misinterpret new information that comes in, especially when it contradicts their goals, as we'll discuss today. So when we talk about irrational leaders, we're really drawing on a really significant amount of research on the psychology of decision-making. And so people who talk about the process of decision-making emphasize that the final decisions for war and peace are made by individual human beings. So no matter what the structural or domestic political factors at play, there will always be a psychological element to decision-making that we can't forget. And what they focus on especially is the cognitive process that leads to these decisions and how that can distort the information and the deliberation and the final decision itself. So most simply, as we have pictured here, two individual leaders who are quite significant. Different leaders make different decisions, and that's in part because different leaders have different backgrounds, and those backgrounds include different life experiences, different formative experiences. They're socialized differently. They live in different regime types. They have different interpretations of historical events. And this means that they're going to make decisions differently than other individuals. So for example, because of these experiences, some people are more risk acceptant than others. Right? So Tojo, who's the gentleman at the top here, said, in regards to the risk of going to war against the United States, there are times when we must have the courage to do extraordinary things, like jumping with eyes closed off the veranda of the Kiyomizu temple. And that's the temple pictured there. You can see it's about 6 or 7 stories high. So I'm not sure if that would count as courage, but it fit his definition. And then we look at someone like Julius Caesar, right, who famously says as he crosses the Rubicon to engage in the military campaign that will destroy the Roman Republic, he says, the die is cast. And numerous translations of this expression give the impression that this is almost a dismissive expression, that he's saying, well, let's see what happens, right? Highly risk acceptant individual. So different people make different decisions based on their life experience and their interpretation of historical events.
Не напрямую можно,
Another way of thinking about this is the concept of operational codes. And so an operational code is the philosophical beliefs about the nature of politics that certain individuals have. And it's their beliefs about conflict, and also instrumental beliefs about the efficacy of alternative strategies for advancing one's interests. So this is, in a sense, what they think works in international relations. So, for instance, does war arise from intentional decisions or by chance due to miscalculation? Beliefs about what we think causes wars will actually influence how leaders behave in the international system. So if, for instance, you think that wars are caused by a failure to deter someone from doing something that's contrary to your interests, then you build up your military capabilities in order to deter them. However, if you think that wars are caused by arms races and miscalculation, then you refrain from building up your capabilities because you're worried that that's going to cause a war. Okay, so different ways of interpreting how wars are caused, different basically theories of international relations will affect how leaders make decisions in the international system. They also have beliefs about what strategies will work. Right? If they think maybe coercive diplomacy works, that if you show initiative and aggression, then countries you might believe are likely to come onto your side and bandwagon with you to serve your interests. Also, there are complicated calculations when we're talking about strategy between individuals and their beliefs about each other. Right? So you have your perceptions of your adversary, but then you also have your perceptions of your adversary's perceptions of you. Right, and that's a complicated sort of chess game going on there. And the example here I would use, as you can see here pictured, Khrushchev and Kennedy, would be Khrushchev and Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis and their views of each other and how that changed their strategies in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Khrushchev was convinced that John F. Kennedy was a weak leader, that he was indecisive. And he got that impression from the fact that Kennedy launched a covert operation to overthrow Castro's communist regime. And when the mission started to experience setbacks, Kennedy did not reinforce the attempt, but rather abandoned the mission and actually abandoned the Cuban exiles that were sent in to prison in Cuba. And then he also allowed the Berlin Wall to be built. And Khrushchev saw both these things as evidence that John F. Kennedy was a weak leader. And this was one of the things that inspired him to put missiles into Cuba, offensive nuclear missiles into Cuba, well, defensive in his interpretation. So how leaders perceive each other, whether it's rational or based on conceptions of weakness versus strength, will determine how leaders behave. Leaders also have different understandings of what threats are and how to interpret them. So one of the things that human beings do is we develop cognitive shortcuts to make decisions. And these cognitive shortcuts can actually distort information as the information comes in and we assess that information. So for one of the simple ones, a little bit out of order there, apologize for that. So confirmation bias, as you see, is the third bullet point there, right? So what happens here is that leaders pay closest attention to evidence that conforms to their beliefs about a situation. And they ignore contradictory evidence that does not conform to those beliefs. Often, indeed, they will stop searching for new information once their bias has been confirmed. So this goes to the fourth point on rationality, if you recall, where it says that leaders accurately update information. Confirmation bias says, no, they do not do that. They seek the information that confirms their biases. And this is very important because these cognitive shortcuts can shape decisions in ways that make war more likely. So a really good example of this is the concept of wishful thinking, which is a kind of bias. So the idea here is basically how much you want something to happen influences how likely you think it is that that thing will happen. So if there's something you really need to happen, you're influenced to think that it will be more likely that that thing will happen. And so a couple of examples here. In the lead up to the Second World War, Neville Chamberlain, who's the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time, was convinced by a theory of war called strategic bombing. And the idea was from the Italian theorist Duhay. The basic idea was that the next war would be fought primarily with air forces bombing cities. And many Western leaders, but especially Great Britain, were really interested and terrified by this concept because it meant that the island of Great Britain was going to be vulnerable to attack from other great powers. And this made British leaders very nervous. And they were very enamored with this theory. And also it had a practical purpose for the British, was that it would have been cheaper to build an air force to strike at Germany if it attacked France than to try to build a massive land force to deter Germany from attacking France, which is actually what would have been required. And so what happened was that Chamberlain looked at the Nazi buildup of aircraft and he said, these aircraft are being built for strategic bombing, for bombing cities. And that, first of all, frightened him and other British leaders, but also meant that they didn't look deeply into what these aircraft would actually be used for. And it's clear afterwards that the main role of these aircraft was not to bomb cities, but rather to support tanks and infantry in ground attack, which they execute in Poland and in France in 1940. So the result is that Chamberlain stops looking for information once his belief in the importance of strategic bombing is confirmed. And that means that he doesn't build a deterrent strong enough to actually deter Adolf Hitler from attacking his allies on the continent. Another good example is John F. Kennedy, the CIA and the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Bay of Pigs. So John F. Kennedy takes over the plan for an invasion of Cuba by exiles supported by the US government. And he decides to go ahead with the operation. But he makes a requirement of going ahead with the operation that the CIA assures him that the operation will lead to a general uprising of the people against the Castro regime. Now, the CIA has been planning this invasion since the Eisenhower administration, and they want very much to carry it out. And so they start to look for evidence that a general uprising would indeed be produced by the operation that Kennedy has decided to launch. And they find some evidence, and then they stop looking, and they ignore contrary evidence that says that a general uprising will not occur, which is what happens in the end. There is no general uprising. But the desire of the CIA to go ahead with this operation influences their interpretation of the information surrounding the likelihood of a general uprising in Cuba as a result of the invasion. So that's some wishful thinking in action, some non-rational decision-making here. Another common theory that is non-rational is prospect theory. So what prospect theory says is that, might be out of order here again. There we go. So what prospect theory says is that people are more likely to take a risk at the prospect of recovering losses than the prospect of new gains. Okay, so that people are more likely to engage in risky behavior to recover what they perceive as losses rather than engage in risky behavior to get new gains. Okay, so the argument is that that's a psychological, basically a psychological trick that we play on ourselves, but that is quite common among people and that actually influences decision making. So if there's a prospect of gain, then leaders will be cautious. But if there's a prospect of loss, then leaders will engage in risky behavior. So if there's a prospect of loss or the leader already sees themselves as having taken a loss, then they are more likely to gamble, to engage in risky behavior. And one of those risky behaviors is war, because war is a very uncertain undertaking. So this risky behavior, right? Leaders will take risks to recover losses rather than cutting their losses and giving up, which would be the rational thing to do. They should be rationally assessing, not looking back and trying to recover losses that cannot, in fact, be recovered. So interestingly, prospect theory also might help us explain why wars escalate once they've begun. So if we think about this simply, right, if we think leader A attacks another country and they gain in the war, so they get new gains, and then they're willing to take risks to protect those gains, right? Because if they lose those gains, that would be a prospect loss. Leader B, who has actually experienced a loss because of leader A's aggression, is now willing to accept risks to recover the losses that they've experienced. So this is all very much about the perspective of the leader themselves. Do they see themselves as having lost something or in danger of losing something in the future? Then they'll be risk acceptant. If they think about the prospect of gain, they're less likely to accept risk to gain things. Okay, so but the problem here, right, is that both leader A and leader B in this scenario, they're both willing to engage in risky behavior in order to get out of the realm of losses. So what happens then is, by this logic, if they're both willing to engage in risky behavior, which is fighting in this scenario, then they escalate instead of negotiating. So I would say one of the things to keep in mind is that there are significant weaknesses to almost every theory of the causes of war. And prospect theory is no different. It's a very attractive theory because it seems to explain many different cases. But one of the weaknesses of prospect theory is that it's likely that it's actually unfalsifiable. And simply what that means is it's impossible to define a case under which it would be proven wrong. Because you could always say, well, that leader engaged in risky behavior because they saw themselves as being in a realm of losses. Or that leader was cautious because they saw themselves as not. And sometimes you can use the same explanation for a leader's, or rather different explanations for a leader's behavior that is consistent with prospect theory. And it becomes really difficult to determine whether you're actually explaining anything or you're just engaging in post hoc justification. Another interesting theory, rational theory of the causes of war, is one known as the myths of empire. So this was proposed by Jack Snyder, a very famous American international relations theorist. And it's quite a complicated theory, but I'll go through the sort of basic outlines of it. So myths of empire says that leaders must make up myths about their country and themselves to keep public support within their state. So this is instrumental in terms of the domestic politics. So the first myth is that other states are very hostile. The second myth is that empire is beneficial and wars will be brief. Empire is beneficial and wars will be brief. The third myth is that coercion and intimidation is easy, and that actually in the international system, bandwagoning is common. So bandwagoning is when one state sees another state behaving aggressively or rising in power, and instead of banding together with other states against that state, they join the powerful state. They bandwagon with the powerful state to to get some of the gains that that state will gain from its the use of its power. So interestingly, what happens here, the explanation is for overexpansion. That's really what Jack Snyder wants to look at here. So we could use, I think, a really powerful example here would be Adolf Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union in on June 22nd, 1941, right? So this would be a massive overstretch, right? Imperial overstretch, as it were. So, and the explanation here is that leaders start to believe their own myths, right? And this leads to overconfidence and overexpansion. So they build the myths for domestic political purposes, but then those myths start to be reinforced so consistently that they sort of become part of the leader's identity, and they start to believe their own myths about the international system, their capabilities, and the other states in the international system that they are indeed threatening. So these ideas or myths originally for domestic consumption become a catalyst for risky behavior by leaders, including war. I want to go to the conclusion here. It looks like we'll have lots of time for Q&A, so that's really good. So let's talk about the conclusion and the implications here. So decision makers are often less than rational. I think the history demonstrates that pretty well. And as I said, most theories of the causes of war have some weakness, right? They overlook important alternative explanations. So even the most diehard theorists of international relations admit that their theories don't explain every case, and that likely to explain any significant event in international relations, like a war, what's going to be required are multiple different theories at the individual level, the domestic political level, and the structural level of international relations, because all those things are really going to affect the final decisions for war and the sort of the situation the different states are put into. But it's vital then to appreciate both the rational and the irrational causes of war, because if we do that, then we come closer to understanding war and can work to avoid it when possible. That is, I mean, really, if you think about what it is that we're doing when we do social science and the causes of war, we're hoping to be able to predict under what conditions wars occur. And because war is so devastating, we would like to not have it happen as often, right? So unfortunately, however, the diversity of the potential causes of wars mean that it's unlikely to disappear from human experience. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for giving me the time to speak to you about this, and I really look forward to your questions. Okay. I selected. I can hear you. I can hear you now. Okay. Okay.
Можна запитувати? В мене питання буде українською. Я вже традиційно буду перша, хто запитує. У мене таке питання. Ну, я вгадаю, для кожної країни, незалежно, ірраціональні це причини чи не ірраціональні, є питання виправдання ризиків. Ну, має ж бути якась межа, коли ризик перестає бути вартим втрат і його розширення. Чи мають ірраціональні причини якусь межу ризику? Ну, якось так. Дякую.
That's a good question. Well, I think by definition, if they're irrational, then they're not good at assessing risk. And so one would think that the ultimate risk that they might not be willing to take is one that a decision that ensures themselves being removed from power. And I think it's good that you brought up the concept of justification, because that is always a very important part of how leaders not only decide to go to war, but try to bring along the populace with them. They always need to provide some kind of justification for it. Even in authoritarian regimes, there has to be some justification provided, because the average person is not going to fight hard in a war if they think they're fighting for an unjust cause. So even the most brutal tyrants tend to justify their campaigns actually in defensive terms, right? They say they're fighting for defensive purposes. So justification is very important. I think rational leaders tend to not be very good at assessing risk. So that's a dangerous problem. So very, very good question. Thank you. I hope that answered it.
Я людина любопитна. У мене тут, от ваша відповідь, мені поставила ще одне питання. Ну, я живу в Україні, і от для мене реально неймовірно велике питання, адже ми бачимо яскравий приклад того, що вже Путін ризикує вже всім. Просто він вже поставив усю країну, весь народ, аби вже він повністю готовий на все. І от я задавала це питання попередньому лектору і задам це питання вам. От дивіться, вони вже, ну скажімо так, ризик, як на мене, не виправданий. Адже їх ненавидить весь світ. Вже, якщо раніше до народу Росії не було претензій, то зараз і вже і саме населення Росії також не сприймається нормально людьми. Чи розуміє Путін, що його ризик невиправданий? І логічно, що він вже не раціональний керівник, але цікаво, як ви гадаєте, чи він зупиниться взагалі хоч на чомусь, на шляху до того, поки його не здвинуть з його місця керівника, адже ну, його ризик реально не виправданий. Але цікава ваша думка. Як ви гадаєте, виправдано чи не виправдано? І чи він реально зупиниться з часом? Дякую.
Those are some good questions. I mean, the first one I would say is it's obviously unjustifiable to engage in this kind of aggressive war, and especially the way he's using military force. A classic example was the attack on the Danes the other day after the major losses of territory. So risk is, I'm going to try and address these somewhat separately. So risk is an important concept here, is that sometimes your ability to show that you can accept more risk than the other side is an advantage, right? And can actually make them back down. So I think part of what Putin is doing is he's trying to, you know, when he does things like make nuclear threats, he's trying to capitalize on the fact that people see him as a very risk-acceptant person. Now, in terms of can Putin be stopped or what Putin is going to do next or any of these questions, since the beginning of this conflict, since the, not including Crimea, but since the beginning of the major operation that he engaged in to try to topple the entire Ukrainian state, I was completely taken off guard by that. So I'm officially taking myself out of the prediction business, because it's very, very difficult to predict what he will do next. You know, and every time I start to do that, he does something unexpected, which, if you're thinking strategically, that's kind of an advantage, right? To be unpredictable is an advantage. There's this famous story of Richard Nixon where he's talking with Henry Kissinger, and Henry Kissinger is negotiating with the North Vietnamese during the Vietnam War. And Nixon, it's sort of nicknamed the Madman Gambit, right? Nixon says to Kissinger, he says, "You tell him that you're not sure whether I'm going to drop the bomb or not. Right? You tell him that you're not sure that I might go crazy and decide to use nuclear weapons." Right? That is part of enhancing your negotiating position. Right? If people think that you're irrational, if people think that you're highly risk acceptant, then they start to get very worried about what your next action is going to be. And so that can be an advantage in negotiation. And I think partly that is what Putin is doing, is showing, is trying to show, especially the United States and the NATO allies, that he is willing to accept incredible risk to achieve his objectives. And I think he's doing that for instrumental reasons. So what will stop Vladimir Putin? I cannot say. And I think an interesting counterfactual to ask. So counterfactual is just when you say, what if things have been different? Well, how might the world look differently? Would be to say, if Putin is removed from power, do we think the war would end? Or do we think that would be the magic bullet to end the conflict in Ukraine? I'm just not sure. I mean, I think that we would hope that would be the case, but there might be another leader that replaces Putin that thinks that the war ought to be continued, and that the problem was that Putin just wasn't fighting effectively enough. So I don't know that that the removal of Putin would necessarily lead to an end of the conflict. It depends on who replaces Vladimir Putin. So great question. I'll have to look back and see what the previous lecturer gave us his answer, so we can compare notes.
I also have a question. So we were, you were talking about different risks, and I would say that throughout the history, we've seen Russian regime and Putin himself taking various decisions, like, for example, justifying war in Chechnya by faking terroristic attacks and trying to murder his opposition leaders. And so he was taking a lot of risks already, like killing children in some of the regions while faking that terroristic attack, right? So we kind of see this character development of Putin and how he's moving towards being a worse and worse every when he takes these decisions. And how do you think, I mean, it's hard to make any predictions, but is nuclear threat real, or it's just a threat? Thank you.
This is a very difficult question. So is the nuclear threat real in practical terms? Yes. Because not all nuclear weapons are for destroying entire cities. There are quite small nuclear weapons that you could use in a battlefield scenario, and Russia has them. So that is one practical possibility. is that he could use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukrainian forces. The problem is that if he did that, it would be the second time only in history that nuclear weapons have been used. And that would, there'd be serious dangers of escalating the conflict to include nuclear, to include the NATO allies and other nuclear powers. So that would be an incredibly risky move. I cannot predict his behavior, but it would be an incredibly risky move to use tactical nuclear weapons. But in practical terms, could they be used? Yes, they could be used. It would be up to his, and you know, I could see a scenario in which he would think that that might be an option if his military forces continue to buckle under the attack from the Ukrainians. Great question. Sorry, I don't have a more hopeful answer. Sorry, I can't say definitely not. I just don't know. But practically, it is possible that you can use tactical nuclear weapons.
Because we've seen how Putin tries to repeat the history, how he's using, you know, the same dates to start different events, like 21st of September when he announced the mobilization, and it feels like he's just trying to repeat something that was done before. So just, yeah, interesting coincidence.
Could you clarify that last point? How do you mean repeat?
I mean, sometimes when I see what he's doing, and it's very similar to what Hitler was doing, like the lying to his people and showing the threat that doesn't really exist. And like he's just trying to be one of those leaders that would be part of the history.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, the point comes up about justification. You know, even somebody like Putin, if he's trying to engage in this conflict just so that he can become, you know, the next Peter the Great, he has to provide the people with a justification. Now, what I say to my students about that is, in some ways, that's hopeful in the sense that even the most brutal tyrants have to appeal to justice. That means that the average person does not want to doesn't want to fight in a war that they don't think has any justification. That to me is hopeful about human beings, because it says that we don't want to fight in an unjust cause. And I think one of the reasons why Ukrainians fight so well is because they know that they're fighting in a just cause. They know that they've been unjustly attacked and that they're trying to repel that attack and recapture their sovereignty from unjustified aggression. So yes, you're right. History does repeat itself, unfortunately. And these justifications, you know, he's justified this war in defensive terms, which is really not surprising historically. Yeah, great question.
Я знову з питаннями. Дивіться, от ну, всі ми добре розуміємо, що прийде час, коли війна завершиться. Ми сподіваємось, це буде дуже скоро. І от в мене таке питання. Чи готовий світ до змін? Адже розуміння того, що якби Європа та інші країни світу здогадалися боротися з путінським режимом ще в 2014-му, коли все це лише починалося, це б мало б інші результати на даний момент. І в мене питання, чи готовий світ зараз, коли війна завершиться, реформуватися так, щоб в майбутньому такі моменти пресікалися відразу, а не чекати моменту, доки вже буде тотальна війна, тотальна боротьба без будь-якого моменту повернення назад. І чи готова якась країна все ж таки брати відповідальність за дії інших? Адже зараз ми бачимо, що кожна країна хоч і підтримує, але прям такого рішення, що так не можна і треба змінювати, ну, жодна країна не показує. Більшість все ж за нейтралітет. Чи зміниться все це? І чи зміниться навіть та сама ООН, яка все ж була створена в принципі, задля збереження миру, щоб потім, можливо, якщо війни й були, щоб вони закінчувались не так трагічно і не було таких спогадів, як наші українські міста, які зруйновані вщент. Дякую.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is the question that we asked ourselves at the end of the First World War, at the end of the Second World War. So there have been numerous attempts to try to change the international system, to try to make war less likely. Those attempts have been more and less successful. In my opinion, just to take one example, so the United Nations versus the League of Nations. So one of the reasons why the United Nations is accepted and becomes more effective than the League of Nations is that all the great powers at the end of the Second World War sign on to the United Nations because the permanent 5 members are established and given a veto over the most important decisions of the United Nations. And a leader like Stalin, not surprisingly, was not interested in signing on to the United Nations unless a veto was provided. And so one of the reasons why the United Nations has been more successful than the League of Nations is because it has recognized the importance of the great powers in the international system, but that comes with a cost, right? It means that when the great powers don't want something to happen, then they can work through the United Nations to make sure that it doesn't. And so that was an improvement of sorts from the League of Nations, where the League of Nations was one country, one vote, and the United States wasn't even in the League of Nations, even though President Wilson had helped establish it. So there have been many attempts to reform the international system after major wars, and they've been more or less successful. I mean, as I said at the end of my remarks, the diversity of potential causes of war mean that there will not be a point in the future. Again, I say I'm not in the prediction business, but it seems to me highly unlikely that there will be a point in the future when wars cease to happen. I think also at the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of hope that we would come into a period where that war was over as a tool of foreign policy. And we've seen since 1991 that is not the case. That when countries feel like their interests are at threat, they are, if they think it's necessary, they'll use force to try to protect those interests. So, sorry, I don't have a more optimistic response. Now you know how all my students feel when they leave my classes.
Пітер, я дуже дякую вам за лекцію і за те, що ви таким чином підтримуєте Україну і українських науковців, студентів в такий важкий для нас час, для нашої країни. Справа в тому, що таким чином ми можемо не просто послухати думку колег, ми можемо трошки відсторонитися і ще раз подивитися на ситуацію зовню. Те, що насправді дуже важко зробити, коли знаходишся всередині цих страшних подій, що відбуваються. І в мене є одна ремарка і одне питання. Перше, наша війна дійсно справедлива, але справа навіть не стільки в тому, що вона справедлива, а скільки в тому, що це війна на виживання. Події, які відбулися в Бучі, в Ірпіні, повністю зруйнований Маріуполь, і ми не знаємо, скільки там людських жертв було. Це, я знаю, в міжнародній політиці зараз цей термін намагаються не застосовувати, але це геноцид українського народу. Тому це війна за виживання. Так, вона справедлива, але вона на виживання українців, тому що якщо ми програємо, не буде не просто країни, не буде нації. Я думаю, зі мною погодяться мої колеги, як викладачі, так і студенти. Да, і власне питання. те, що Путін нераціональний лідер, те, що Росія нераціональна країна, ну це ми давно усвідомлюємо. Я б хотіла у вас спитати, наскільки, навіть не так, світові лідери могли раніше оцінити, наскільки Путін нераціональний? Це питання десь схоже з тим, як далі він може піти. Але хотілося б от вашу думку почути. Раніше колеги, політики, от саме світові лідери, очільники розуміли, наскільки він нераціональний, на як далі він зможе піти, що може використовувати, тому що обстріли Південно-Української атомної станції, яка знаходиться від нас не так далеко, були. Постійні загрози Запорізької атомної станції відбуваються, і це вже було. Світові лідери могли це передбачити до війни. Війну могли передбачити, я це розумію, служби про це говорили. А от на що він так надалі може піти, розуміли чи ні? Дякую вам заздалегідь.
Yeah, very good question. I mean, I would agree that the Ukrainian war is indeed justified. There's been few wars in the 21st century that are more justified. So one of the things that you seek in war is surprise. And I think the extent of Putin's invasion of Ukraine was indeed that. Part of the issue was, though, I think, and one of the reasons I presented the myths of empire theory is that I think Putin overestimated his military's ability to actually capture Ukraine rapidly and underestimated the Ukrainian will to fight. I think in part because he honestly believes the stories that he tells his people and himself about Ukraine, he believes them. And that produces an over-optimism when it comes to military force. But that move, I think, was highly unexpected. I was under the impression at the time when we were talking about how, you know, the United States was saying, we have evidence that he's going to launch an operation imminently. There were many examples in the Cold War where you had large-scale military operations that did not end in the invasion of other countries, and then some that did. Right? Czechoslovakia in 1968 begins as a military exercise and ends in an invasion of 200,000 troops, Soviet troops into Czechoslovakia. So it is very difficult to predict the future. It's part of the, but what you can do is try to set yourself up for multiple different alternative pathways for those leaders. So build a strategy that has flexibility in it. I'm not sure that the United States and the NATO allies did that. I think they've been preoccupied with things like COVID and their response to COVID and the economic fallout from COVID. I think one of the reasons that Putin predicts, or the reason that Putin invades Ukraine is because it's not a NATO ally, right? And that he picked his target carefully. And so I think some of his actions are predictable, but others are not. I mean, as I said, I was under the impression in the lead up to the war that he was going to just send more troops into the east of Ukraine and occupy another sort of sliver of Ukrainian territory. The attempt to totally overtake the country to me was totally, it was incredible. I was shocked, blown away by it. I was also shocked by the fact that the Russian military then seemed to be completely incapable of launching a coordinated, combined arms attack that would topple the European government. But I think that was his hope, right? That was Vladimir Putin's hope, was that he could defeat the Ukrainians rapidly and present the United States with a fait accompli, right? It was the same rationale that Khrushchev uses for getting the missiles into Cuba. He tries to get them in secretly, thinking that if he can just present the Americans with the missiles already operational, that John F. Kennedy will buckle right? So a lot of what's going on here too is leaders' assessments of the willingness of other leaders to engage in risky behavior. And there seems to be very little stomach for risky behavior on the side of the NATO allies, because they are worried about the use of nuclear weapons. I don't know if that answered your question. I just difficult to predict, especially someone like Vladimir Putin's behavior.
Thank you.
У мене є
Okay.
питання.
Go ahead, Igor.
Thank you for lecture, Mr. Campbell. And I want to add the one main reason of why dictators make war. Majority of dictators have unhappy past. For example, Hitler, he had unhappy past. He wanted to be make paints, but he failed, and he became dictator. Stalin had criminal life. He became a dictator. Vladimir Putin, he had he had unhappy past, and he became a dictator. And the averages people who beat him in physical and the moral, psychological sense of the word in the past. Do you think it is it the main reason or not? And I want to add, no, it is this my question.
Oh.
Understand me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm and actually I heard a similar argument was made about Vladimir Putin at the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. One media commentator said, if I was Vladimir Putin's mother, I would have loved him more, and then maybe we would have been able to avoid this conflict. I am skeptical of that explanation, just because many people have very unhappy pasts, and not all of them become terrible people. Right? Many people in history are able to rise above their experience and become good people or even great people. There's numerous saints who would be examples of this. So I think the problem with that explanation is that you're reasoning backwards from the actions of the leader and saying that it was the unhappy past that caused the decisions. It may have contributed to it, but I would say I'd be hesitant to say that's the only reason for the actions that they take. So it's a psychological explanation. I also, in regard to the question previously about Putin being irrational, I think in strategy, it's dangerous to assume that your adversary is irrational, right? Because you don't lose anything by assuming that they're very intelligent, right? And that they know what they're doing. However, if you think that they're irrational, then you might not actually expect a coherent strategy out of them, which if they have, then you're in a very bad position. So I would say, even if he has irrational aspects to his decision-making, that doesn't mean he can't think strategically. And, we don't lose anything by assuming that he is capable of thinking strategically. Yeah, very good questions. A lot of food for thought.
Oh, thank you for answer.
Valera, do you have a question?
Я хочу запитати, чи є ще ірраціональні правителі, які можуть зашкодити Україні?
Are there irrational leaders out there in the world who can harm Ukraine? Is that the question? Yes, and there are also rational leaders in the world who can harm Ukraine. In the sense that rational leaders may be so terrified of escalation to, for instance, the nuclear level or the expansion of the war into a war between Russia and NATO, that they might try to coerce the Ukrainians into making a deal that they don't want. And they would probably use things like inducements like economic aid to try to get the Ukrainians to give up territory in order to end the war. And that might actually be one of the rational explanations for why Putin is so extreme in his actions, is that he thinks at the end of the day that the international community, especially the United States, that if the situation gets bad enough, that they will turn on the Ukrainians and they will try to compel them to make peace at any price. So it's not just the irrational leaders you have to worry about. There are also rational leaders who, for different reasons, have interests contrary to those of Ukraine at times. So that's why I said at the end, it's important to remember to appreciate both the rational and irrational causes of war, because they're both at play in any conflict.
Дякую.
Hello. So I'm looking at my screen. I'm seeing the person in the top left corner, but unfortunately I can't read their name because it's in Ukraine.
Так, добрий день.
Yes.
В
Hi.
мене питання. Як ви вважаєте, взагалі, як ви ставитеся до референдумів на тимчасово окупованих територіях і до того, що планується 30 вересня оголошення результатів і оголошення про входження їх у склад Росії? Тобто, і які можуть бути наслідки потім далі? Як з нашого боку, нашої країни, так і з їх боку. Мене дякую. Все.
Well, I mean, I looked at the returns from the referendum and was reminded of a lot of Cold War history. And even, sometimes I wonder why these authoritarian regimes make the proportion so high. Right? Why was it 98% of the people want to join Russia? That seems incredibly unlikely, but historically that does see, the incredibly high percentages are often, well, they're often evidence that it's a total sham. And I think it is the case here again. Again, I think it's related to justification, is that if these parts of Ukraine are subsumed into Russia, then any attack on those territories becomes an attack on Russia. So then it becomes a pretense for the expansion of what Putin has already said is a defensive war. So it's an attempt to him to pursue additional justification for, I think, for further aggression in those areas, because he can now claim, at least maybe to the Russian people, though I'm not sure how much they're buying this, that the people in the occupied areas want to become part of Russia. So I find it quite concerning, because it seems to me like he's setting up a situation that would permit him to act even more aggressively in the protection of those areas. Again, though, I'm not an expert on Ukraine, so that's sort of speculation on my part. I study strategy, and sometimes you have to get into the heads of pretty unpleasant people, and that's how I would think he's thinking about this. But I'm open to alternative explanations.
Колеги, я думаю, нам час подякувати нашим чудовим лектору і організатору і більше не забирати їх час, оскільки у нас з вами робочий день завершується, а у них тільки починається. Тому я думаю, ми дякуємо. Нам дуже приємно і дуже все це корисно було почути. І перепрошуємо за те, що трохи вже перебрали вашого часу.
It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Yeah, it's a wonderful opportunity. And thank you for the fantastic questions. You've given me a lot to think about. Yeah. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.